Hey everybody, this is Kevin again, and this is the second part of my The Truth About Inflation video series. And we're going to look at more evidence that the Federal Reserve and the government are still lying to us about inflation and how they plan on fighting it.
I think I was wrong then about the path that inflation would take.
Inflation.
If you watched my first video, I promised to keep this one shorter. If you haven't yet watched it, there is a link to it in the description of this video, and I really encourage you to check it out. I go into a lot of detail as to why the Fed raising interest rates is not going to solve our inflation problem, why it will end up being more disastrous for our economy, and why the Federal Reserve will eventually be forced to bring rates back down and, in my opinion, keeping inflation running high. But let's go ahead and continue for now. Yesterday we received new CPI data for the month of June, and it's not good. Month-over-month inflation from May to June was 1.3%, and year-over-year inflation came in at 9.1%. If you annualize the month-over-month, that's a 15.6% inflation rate. And if you look at the CPI data, I mean, pretty much everything went up across the board. And so both of these numbers, the month-over-month and the year-over-year, these both came in higher than anyone at the Fed expected.
I think we now understand better how little we understand about inflation.
That's not very reassuring.
No, honestly, this was unpredicted. I was looking.
Let's hear someone who absolutely predicted it. Larry Summers, speaking at the London School of Economics, June 20th of this year. Larry Summers was the Treasury Secretary under President Clinton and a leading economic advisor to Obama during the financial crisis.
It was reasonable to forecast that the United States would have, during the year, an average GDP gap on the order of 2 to 3%. 13 or 14% of GDP in fiscal stimulus against a 2% GDP gap seemed to me overwhelmingly likely to produce an overheating of the economy. Stimulus of this magnitude would drive very rapid nominal GDP growth, as it did, and that with 11.6% nominal GDP growth, it was hard to imagine inflation not being out of the range of target levels of inflation. And so, to this day, I do not understand why this view was not more widely shared, since rather than being a synthetic insight, it seemed to me to be an application of textbook macroeconomics.
So that was a very dry politician, accountant way of saying, why is everyone saying that they didn't expect to see this level of inflation when this is textbook macroeconomics? So when they get on TV and say they didn't see this coming, they are lying to your face. I mean, of course they knew what to expect. It is literally, like Larry Summers just said, textbook macroeconomics. Well, as I pointed out in my first video, we are probably already in a recession. A recession is defined as 2 or more consecutive quarters of negative GDP. We already had negative GDP growth of minus 1.6% in quarter 1 of this year. The Atlanta branch of the Federal Reserve expects to see negative GDP growth in quarter 2 of minus 2.1%. That is the technical definition of a recession. So how long will it last? Well, if the Fed continues to raise interest rates, it will likely last for longer than normal. The average length of a recession in the US is 17 months. Since 1980, that average has dropped to about 10 months. However, typically during a recession, the government and the Federal Reserve stimulate the economy to bring us out of recession. The government does this by expanding unemployment benefits and welfare benefits, even direct stimulus and tax cuts. The Federal Reserve does this by lowering interest rates to stimulate spending in the economy, keep people borrowing money, keep people spending money. You see where this is going? The Fed right now is trying to tighten the money supply, to restrict the economy to bring down inflation, right? So they have exactly 0 tools at their disposal to do both things at once. In fact, until the 1970s, economists didn't even believe that it was possible to have inflation and a recession at the same time. They invented a whole new term for it, and maybe you've been hearing it lately, stagflation. So stagflation is when high inflation persists during a period of recession or flat economic growth. Okay, so how does this all tie together? Well, a recession will bring higher unemployment and obviously leads to less consumer spending. Less consumer spending is crucial to slow the economy and bring down our 40-year record high inflation. The Fed thinks that raising interest rates alone will bring inflation down by tightening the money supply. But why should we believe them? I mean, I've already told you that I firmly believe they're outright lying to us. Let's take a look at their track record for the last year and a half and see what you think. In January 2021, both Jerome Powell and Janet Yellen believed that we would not see inflation despite unprecedented central bank money printing and government spending. Here's Yellen again in March 2021 saying inflation fears are unfounded despite another $1.9 trillion in spending. Just a month later, they could no longer lie to us that there was no inflation. Instead, they told us it would be transitory, that it was just due to supply chain constraints from COVID, and we would see it drop after these supply chains recovered. And we heard the word transitory for the entire rest of 2021. In May 2021, Yellen still wasn't worried about inflation, saying that the extra spending was small relative to GDP. More on that later. And that it was still just a supply chain problem. By December, they finally admitted that inflation would not, in fact, be transitory, but would be persistent. Starting in early 2022, we began hearing about peak inflation. The media was floating the idea that we had reached peak inflation and would see prices start coming down. However, in March of this year, Yellen was admitting that we would have another year of, quote, very uncomfortably high inflation. But by then, they had Vladimir Putin to blame for the continued inflation. If you watched my previous video, link in the description below, you'll see what the real cause of inflation is. Fortunately, even Jerome Powell doesn't think you're stupid enough to forget that inflation was high before the war in Ukraine. Here he is in June admitting this, undermining the Biden administration's, quote, Putin's price hike narrative. But there's good news. We aren't going to have a recession. Here's Jerome Powell in March saying he doesn't see a recession coming. Here's Janet Yellen in March saying the same thing. As recently as June 9th, Janet Yellen saw, quote, nothing to suggest that we will go into recession this year. Interesting, because the Atlanta branch of the Federal Reserve, and remember, Janet Yellen was the head of the Federal Reserve before Jerome Powell, so she should know these people and their data very well. The Atlanta Fed says we are already in recession. Bank of America says we will need a deep recession to reverse this massively high inflation. Even Jerome Powell isn't promising a, quote, soft landing anymore. So what does this mean for us? Well, in my previous video, I explained why raising interest rates will undoubtedly backfire and can't possibly be raised high enough to fight the inflation that we're experiencing. Now, if I know that, I can promise that Jerome Powell and Janet Yellen also know that. And I think they are expecting and allowing Bank of America's prediction to come true, that a very deep recession is coming and that our only practical way of bringing inflation down is to just allow it to happen. So why am I making these videos? Well, I think a lot of us are worried, and rightfully so, about what might be coming next. And I think a lot of us are being misinformed and intentionally being misinformed. So what I'm hoping to illustrate here is how they're lying to us. They're playing stupid. They're pretending that a recession isn't on the horizon, that the economy is doing fine, that the consumer is stronger than they've ever been before. And it's just not true. Here's a clip of Jerome Powell just a couple weeks ago talking about how strong the economy is and how good a shape the consumer's in.
You look at the strength of the economy, households are in very strong financial shape. They've still got a lot of excess savings from forced saving from not being able to travel and things like that, and also from fiscal transfers. So households are overall in strong shape. The same thing is true of businesses.
Here's the White House press secretary saying that the economy has never been stronger.
What I'm trying to say to you is that the economy is in a better place than it has been historically.
I mean, they really think that little of you, and they think you're that stupid, that you won't even believe your own eyes. So that's why I'm making these videos, because, I'm a weirdo and I follow all this stuff, and I know a lot of people just don't, and maybe it's don't have the time, don't think it's relevant to you, whatever the case may be. It's all relevant. It's all important. It's affecting all of us. I think this is important to at least have a survey level understanding of what's going on, and just don't believe what you're hearing in the mainstream media and from the White House and from the Treasury Secretary. I mean, they're straight up lying to us. Even if you want to give them the benefit of the doubt and say that their intentions are good, what they're doing at best is trying to not panic people by ignoring the crisis that may be right around the corner. If you agree with me, let me know. If you disagree with me, let me know. And I'll be making another video in a week or two, more in general about the Federal Reserve, what they do, their role in our economy, and the control of our money supply. So, all right, thanks again. Bye.